Drugs have been used since before recorded history. Egyptians and Persians used poppy, or opium, for recreational purposes. Marijuana was used by Arabs at the time of the Crusades, and the ancient Greeks knew drug abuse as well. Coca and magic mushrooms were used all throughout Mexico and South America. Drug use in Europe was socially acceptable until well into the 20th century, with the British royal family often using cocaine and heroin openly. Factors that led to the current United States drug laws include rural religious creeds of Methodists, Presbyterians, and Baptists specifically, medical literature that showed the use of morphine and opium as a vice, the depiction of drug users as habitual criminals, and racial intolerance of opium users who were typically Chinese and marijuana users who were typically Mexican. The Prohibition experiment in the 1920s and 1930s was led by moral crusaders called the Temperance Movement. Urbanism was viewed as a threat to the U.S. agrarian culture, with its attendant evil of drinking, which was seen as the main force behind the degenerate lifestyles of new immigrants from Ireland and Eastern Europe. To combat this, the 18th Amendment was passed in 1919 and ratified then. It failed, and dreadfully. Organized crime made a huge success at selling alcohol, and since purchasing alcohol was not criminalized, customers could not be held responsible for it. Law enforcement agencies were easily corrupted by bootleggers, and after making organized crime an extremely successful business by creating a black market, Prohibition was repealed in 1933. The extent of substance abuse is widespread. The most recent reports on the world drug problem, however, indicate that drug cultivation and import is in decline, and that drug enforcement agencies have become very good at catching shippers and seizing shipments before they ever make landfall. Opium poppy cultivation has declined by 23% since 2007, and coca by 13%. Poppy cultivation in the Golden Triangle has fallen by nearly 80% since the year 2000, and that region is now almost opium-free. Individual drug use has also been in decline in the United States and elsewhere. From 55% of all youth in 1999 using drugs, that's fallen to 48%. Overall drug use is stable, but marijuana use has risen where other kinds of drugs have declined, and changing social attitudes toward marijuana may be part of the reason why this is happening. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health finds that drug use trends have been relatively stable in the past few years, although an estimated 20 million Americans aged 12 or older had used an illicit drug just in the past year. About half of all these people were using marijuana. Alcohol abuse, unfortunately, is still rampant. At least half of all Americans 12 years old or older report having had at least one drink in the past 30 days. A fourth of the population reports binge drinking, which is 5 or more drinks within a couple of hours within the past 30 days. And 7% of the population aged 12 or older report what we think of as heavy use, binge drinking at least 5 separate times in the past 30 days. More than 1/3 of teens 18 years old and older are known to be binge drinkers. Now, what causes substance abuse? There are several possible explanations. The subcultural view holds that there's an environmental aspect to drug abuse. This concentrates on lower-class addiction and ties drug use to racial prejudice and low self-esteem and economic disadvantage and the general level of criminogenic problems that we see in impoverished areas. The psychological view states that people who are addicts tend to have personal pathologies, including low frustration tolerance, anxiety, psychopathy, or sociopathy. Drugs may help people deal with these problems and reduce depression and other issues, and drug use as self-medication is common. But another view in psychology says that lack of contact with other people creates isolation, and that isolation leads to drug addiction. There is some scientific backing for this with experiments on rats. For example, the rat park experiment showed that addiction was very common in rats who were isolated in separate cages, but when they were placed in a large living space that had both regular water and drug-laced water available, but they also had other rats, food, opportunities for play, and opportunities for free mating available in the larger living space, their use of the drug-laced water pretty much stopped. This included rats that had originally been addicted in isolated cells and were then introduced to the rat park population. Once they got the other rats with them, they stopped drinking the drug-laced water. Genetics may also indicate that people whose parents were alcoholics or addicts have a greater chance of becoming addicts themselves. But not all children of drug-dependent parents become addicts, so environment and socialization must play some kind of a role as well. Learning how to use your drugs from your parents or your peers is the sum total of the idea behind social learning. If you learn that drugs are pleasurable, you may experiment with them, especially if that helps you lower anxiety and tension as a result. Problem behavior syndrome takes drug users and labels them as emotionally distressed, alienated, and maladjusted. It includes drug use as just one factor among many, and other factors include poor home life, history of family substance abuse, educational failure, and social alienation. Rational choice theory says that drug abusers make thought-out, rational thought choices to escape reality and relieve tension by using drugs. And this also indicates that these users believe that using drugs will make them smarter or more powerful, and so that's a good reason to use them because it gives them an advantage over other people in their areas. Finally, there's a question about whether there's a drug gateway. Now, the gateway model says that the use of milder effect drugs like alcohol and marijuana inevitably leads to the use of heavier drugs like crack and heroin. But these studies have recently been called into question by new research, which shows that the main time marijuana is a gateway is only when the user can't obtain their marijuana, so they take something else that's suggested by a different dealer, not their usual dealer who sells them pot. Otherwise, it's actually really rare for marijuana users to progress to crack or heroin abuse. But other recent research has uncovered that the real gateway drug is alcohol. Types of drug users and abusers are numerous, so here are some of the identified categories in research. When it comes to teenagers, we have the ones who deal in small amounts of drugs but don't commit any other crimes, and the ones who deal in large amounts of drugs, but that's the only crime that they do. Then we have adolescents who both deal drugs and commit other crimes. The ones who cycle in and out of the justice system, who tend to be failures at both dealing and crime and are usually very heavy drug users. And the ones who are drug involved and never age out of crime as they become adults, because addiction just fuels their need to continue committing criminal acts so that they can get their fix. When it comes to adults, we have outwardly respectable but high-level dealers. So they look like they're normal people, but they're actually high-level dealers of drugs. There are adult smugglers who import drugs into the U.S., and these are normally middle-aged men, or even older than that, who have connections and capital to invest in the smuggling operation, so they're making money by doing this. There's adult predatory drug users, meaning those who commit predatory crimes, and they frequently get arrested, but there's also the adults who are predatory drug users who rarely get arrested. There are less predatory drug-involved users. There are outwardly respectable adults who are frequent drug users. And then finally, there are the drug-involved female offenders, and these are more likely to be a sex worker or a low-level dealer. So why do we criminalize drugs? Well, in part because we assume that there's a connection between drugs and crime, but we've never actually been able to support it. Self-report studies have shown that users of drugs do tend to have a high involvement in crime, and arrestee data shows that adults who were arrested for a serious violent or property offense were more than 4 times as likely to have used an illicit drug in the past year than those who weren't arrested. Likewise, adults who had been arrested for these offenses were more likely to have used marijuana and other drugs for non-medical reasons. When we look at people who have been incarcerated in correctional surveys, these show that many convicted criminals are lifelong substance abusers. More than 24% of parolees report ongoing drug use, and the drug use among parolees is about twice that of the general population of the United States. Alcohol and drugs are implicated in the commission of many crimes, 78% of violent crimes and 83% of property crimes. However, there is no way to be sure that drugs cause crime. They may go together, they may be related, but drugs as the cause of crime is a hard case to make. We don't know which comes first, the drug use or other criminal behavior, and it is possible that it's just coincidental and there's no cause-effect relationship. Now, the federal government has passed many acts trying to control narcotics. The most recent ones include the 1984 Controlled Substances Act, which created 5 categories of substances that are narcotic and non-narcotic and subject to federal laws. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 set new standards for minimum and maximum sentences for drug offenders, increasing penalties for most offenders, and created a new drug penalty offense for large-scale offenders like those who have trafficked, say, more than 1 kilogram of heroin at one time, for which the first offense penalty was 30 years to life in prison. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 created a coordinated national drug policy headed by a drug czar, and this act included the imposition of the death penalty for a drug-related killing. Many approaches to drug control have been proposed and tried. Among them are source control, which is to stop the large volume dealers and growers before the drugs get to smaller scale dealers. A major effort has been made to destroy crops and arrest cartel leaders in South and Central America, Asia, and the Middle East. Now, this has been met with enormous resistance, and although the overall drug supply is declining, many of those drug-producing countries run mainly or solely on the drug trade in terms of their economic base. So basically, when we go after drug users, or rather drug dealers and drug producers in these areas, this has the effect of completely killing third world country development. The United States also has very little influence in some of the most major drug-growing areas like Colombia and most of the Middle East, and that kind of limits the efforts for source control. Interdiction strategies mean seizure of the drugs before they can get to shore. This has been more effective than many other strategies that have been used by the United States. The reduced purity of street-level cocaine, as well as street prices going up, indicate that the overall supply of cocaine is decreasing. Even so, the use of border-crossing underground tunnels, professional and amateur drug mules, and the bribing of border guards may negate or reduce the effectiveness of many of these interdiction tactics. Law enforcement strategies include going after the street-level dealers and users to make drug use and sales so much of a hassle that consumption is cut back and crime rates go down. Undercover agents posing as dealers and arresting buyers have been especially successful. This is called a reverse sting. However, the inducement of drug profits is hard to counter with just law enforcement efforts. Punishment strategies include long sentences and harsh punishments. And this doesn't really fly with most of the citizens of the United States who think that drugs should be less punished than they are. It also tends to catch a lot of minority group members, especially blacks and Latinos, while letting upper-class users and sellers mostly escape punishment entirely. Community strategies are about the involvement of local community groups like block watches and citizen patrols, as well as use of the civil justice system to harass offenders, and the creation of community-based treatment efforts and improvement of the community overall. Unfortunately, these have shown very little evidence of effectiveness. They work better in stable middle-income areas, but when we get into areas that are impoverished, like the ghetto, it doesn't work so well. Now, education efforts like DARE, Dare to Keep Kids Off Drugs, they sound really appealing, but they don't have much effect. Those who go through DARE don't show any difference in drug use at age 20 from those who have not gone through DARE, but those who do go through DARE also show that their self-esteem goes down. So that's really not the kind of thing that we want to have happen with our kids. Drug testing strategies have become very common in workplaces and in schools, and at least among youth, it does seem to have some reducing effects on drug use. Drug treatment strategies involve programs to remove and wean abusers away from the substances they're abusing. So examples include things like Outward Bound or outdoor activity camps, group therapy approaches, and medical procedures. And these help sometimes, but not as much as we would like. Finally, employment programs put drug users to work to see if it will help them reduce drug use, but a lot of the time, it doesn't. The war on drugs is enormously expensive. It's costing us more than $500 billion with a B dollars in the past 20 years. Although the United States has historical prohibitions on mood-altering substance use, that's common to every indigenous population that researchers know about. So fighting this may be a pointless battle. The war on drugs has not stopped drug use. The effort to control drugs also increases the chance of hepatitis C and AIDS transmission due to the use of dirty needles for injection. When users get caught, their families suffer enormously. Banning drugs creates a black market, just like it did with prohibition and alcohol. In fact, the drug lords are just considered another kind of organized criminal. Remove the black market, and you remove the incentive to deal in drugs. When drugs were legal and free to use in the early 20th century, most users led normal lives, and the proportion of users was about the same as it is now, so this may be a simple social constant that we can't get rid of just by wanting to. If drugs were legalized, price, quality, and distribution could all be controlled by the government. Drug-related deaths would decline, drug-related poverty would go down, and taxes could be collected from the growers and the dealers. The consequences of legislation would be that it could increase the use of drugs in the United States, and taxing them could create a new black market simply to avoid the taxes, which defeats all the other advantages of regulation and quality control. So decriminalization or legalization is thus not a done deal, at least not yet.